Today's video is about silage, but it's not silage in the field using the harvester, it's silage in the pit like this. I've called this the science of silage. That sounds extremely arrogant. I apologise. I'm not saying I'm an expert. To be honest, experts know nothing. I'm just going to take you through what I've learned in the last 10 years, take you through my journey from going from making bad silage to making really good silage. And hopefully it'll be interesting and hopefully you might learn something as well. I wanted to start this video here at the silage face to prove that I can actually make good silage and I'm not just an expert who's never actually went and done it, because that's a big problem, is people tell you what to do in farming but they've never actually put it into practice and done it themselves. So this is the proof of what I'm saying. I can actually make this system work and it pays the bills in this farm big time. So this silage is our fourth cut from this year, and it was put into the pit on the 7th of September, so it's in about 5 or 6 weeks. It's really nice stuff. Probably 26-27% dry matter, high 11s for ME. I haven't got it sampled yet, we've only just started feeding it, but it's just to give you an example of what our actual silage looks like. It is rock solid because of the compactor. I'll chat about that later on. Hopefully that gives me some credibility for what I'm about to say. The video is definitely going to be quite niche. I appreciate that, but so is the milking powder video, and you all loved that. So I'm going to push the boundary about as far as I can go and do like a 20 or 30 minute video talking about silage and research and looking at graphs. And I get it, that's a very different video than I've ever seen from a farmer on YouTube. But one of the main goals for me with this YouTube channel is to do something different, try new things. If they don't work, that's okay. At least I'll know. I'm going to record the rest of this video in the house because today is a horrendous day. It's pouring with rain. So this has already taken me an hour to get some graphs ready, to get this all set up, to get the microphone connected. So I've lost my patience with this video already. There's a chair in the road. There we go. That's the shot's better now. Oh, that's hot tea. Okay, so I'm going to overlay the graphs that I'm talking about. I have the graphs on my computer screen in front of me. So cut to the overlay now. So here's our first graph, and it is also my favorite graph that I've ever made by far. This graph summarizes 12 years of silage samples. There's over 200 silage samples displayed in this one graph. Each silage sample is one of the little dots, and each color represents a year. The key's at the top if you want to see which year which color represents. And then the bar is the average for that year. So looking at individual silage samples is not actually that useful. You can test the same cut of silage 2 or 3 times and you'll get quite a range within that. So that's why we use averages to determine if our silage making system is improving or not improving. Averages also help to level out the effects of weather, although in my opinion, the effect of weather is way overestimated and is often used as an excuse by farmers for why they make bad silage. That's quite a controversial thing to say, I know, but in my experience, that's the reality. So we're going to remove some of the earlier silage results and we're going to zoom in to 2015 to 2023. So we're going from a 12-year range down to an 8-year range. It just makes everything a wee bit clearer, makes it a wee bit easier to talk about, and really all of the big changes in our silage system started after 2015. I don't know if you can see behind me, but that really is a terrible day. There's literally lakes in the fields. It rained so much last night. Right, back to the science of silage. So I'm going to take you through our journey on this farm. I'm going to use like real world practical examples for what we changed and the effect it had. But I'm going to back that up with like a research document and some science. I'm going to link that document down below. I will have it pop up on screen at some points. I'll do that in the edit. I have no idea when they're going to come up. But if you want to learn the scientific reasoning for everything I'm saying, validate everything I'm saying, and put some figures on what I'm saying, go and check it out. I'll link it down below. It is a brilliant like collation of everything I'm going to say based on lots of research. It's where I've learned a lot of how to make really good silage. I probably need to go get that research document. I'm pretty sure it's on my computer. I'll be right back. Okay, it's on my OneDrive. Oh, it was literally right in front of me the whole time. So we're going to go back and look at our graph of average quality over the last 8 years, and we're going to take a few individual pieces, and from that I'm going to tell you what we changed and the effect it had, and then I can show you the evidence of that in the actual graphs. So let's start with dry matter. We used to have a thing called an autoswather on this farm, which is possibly the stupidest invention ever made, and they should have been banned from sale. So instead of mowing our grass out behind our mower, where it had a chance to dry and to wilt, we were mowing our grass into tight 10-foot rows, and then every other row was thrown on top of the previous 10-foot row, making the situation even worse. In 2015, I started to mow the grass out flat behind my mower and not use the autoswather. In 2016 and 17, I done that and got someone to rake our grass into rows. We didn't do it all the time, we just done it sometimes. If you look at the chart, you'll see that our dry matters did start to improve slightly. Then the big breakthrough came in 2018. 2018, I bought a front and a back mower. That allowed two things. Firstly, that forced us to rake all of our grass. We no longer had an autoswather to use. But more importantly, it allowed us to mow more acres quicker. So we were getting all of the grass mowed by early afternoon instead of still mowing late into the evening, so that the grass actually got some sunlight to dry. What I was missing up until 2018 and what I didn't understand, and the first lesson I want to teach all of you, is that almost all of your drying of your grass happens within the first 4 hours, and that is the really crucial moment. So if you're mowing at 7 p.m, 8 p.m, that grass has basically no chance to dry out. Over the night, grass actually goes backwards in dry matter. Your dry matter can reduce, so as in get wetter, by 3 to 4% during the night through a process of respiration and also through dew. And it'll be lunchtime the next day before your grass is as dry as it was the previous evening. So that's all to say, mow your grass at midday at the latest. I mow in the mornings now quite a lot. And try to get it all down so it has a chance to dry by the late afternoon at the very latest. You can see from 2018 until today, our dry matters have been relatively stable. The bars on the graph are sitting at about 25%. We do still get a range. The reason why the dry matters have kind of went backwards a little bit is because we've moved to a more intensive cutting system. We've moved to 4-5 cuts, and we've also shortened the window at which we will leave grass in the field, which means the grass has less time to dry. We'll come on to that when we're chatting about D-value and ME. So a summary from dry matter, you need to get your grass to about 25 to 30%. Do not make dry matter the be all and end all. If it's not going to dry in 24 hours, don't just leave it in the fields to rot and try to get it a wee bit drier. You will get very little drying after the first 4 hours. And anywhere between 23 to 30% I would consider perfect for dry matter. I know some people like drier silage, but I think that just causes more problems with fermentation and heating and molds. So I try to aim for 30. Next, we're going to talk about D-value or energy value, but I'm going to split D-value into two parts. So one part we're going to chat about the D-value or the ME or the energy of the grass which you have in your field at the point of cutting. And then I'm going to talk about how you keep that energy and don't lose it to the point where you're feeding it out, and that's going to be under fermentation. So let's start with D-value in the field. There's a lot of factors which affect your energy value of your grass in the field. Weather has a big impact. Strangely enough, a drought scenario is when we really struggle for energy and it crashes our energy. As you can see from our third cut, that was cut at the start of July this year after only growing for 5 weeks from second cut. We had a really high NDF value and a really low energy value, and that was because that grass grew over a period of drought. It was stressed. It put all of its effort and all of its energy into making seeds, which meant that we lost energy. So there is a big component of the energy in the field to do with weather. Strangely, I found that it's drier weather, which can make worse quality grass, but we'll come on to that during the fermentation process. So crop nutrition plays a big part of getting the energy in your grass to begin with. And by that I mean soil sampling, making sure your soil indexes are 2s or 3s for P and K, applying enough nitrogen. The real way you can tell if you have not applied enough nitrogen, I think, is if you have really low proteins. So if you have a 12 or 13% protein, generally that's a sign you haven't applied enough nitrogen. You want to be getting your protein levels like 15, 16. Biggest effect in devalue in the field is time of cutting. You need to be cutting your grass frequently and at the right stage. And it's almost like a mindset shift as to what you consider a good crop of grass, which is necessary if you want to make really, really good silage. As a guide, a really heavy crop of grass for us would be 1 18-foot trailer per acre. A light crop of grass would be 2 acres per 18-foot trailer. So maybe you can work out in your head what sort of grass you're cutting. If it's 2 18-foot trailers an acre, you're leaving your grass way too long. We do 4 cuts here. Sometimes we do 5 cuts. 5 cuts is a bad idea. 4 cuts is perfect. If you're not grazing your silage fields early in spring, you kind of need to be on a 4-cut system. There is of course exceptions. Maybe you're grazing at the back end of the year and 3 cuts is fine. But I found that 4 cuts is necessary to make the really top quality silage. Reseeding does play a part in devalue in the field, although that is a much longer term thing to change on your farm. I'm still working on it. We still have silage fields which have not been reseeded in 30 or 40 years. We're still making really good quality silage. I would say the biggest factor which reseeding has on the quality of silage is that if you cut really frequently, you actually have something to cut. Them old lays, like they've been in grass for 30 or 40 years, when we're cutting them on a 4-cut system, some of the crops are incredibly light, especially over the summer periods. So a big incentive to reseed is actually just so that you have a grass crop to cut frequently enough to make it worthwhile. If we go back and look at our graph size sample results, we peaked in 2021. That would be the reality from my experience on the farm as well. The cows performed best in 2021 for us. We've been really struggling to get back there ever since. 2022 was very disappointing from an energy level. It was quite a cold, dull year and a cold start to the spring, so that really hurt our first cut. Don't really have any concrete answers for why we struggled so much with energy in 2022. Perhaps 2021 was just an exceptionally good year, and 2022 and 2020 are more our average years. But we only have 3 silage samples so far in 2023. There's a lot of dates, I'm getting confused. But that is our first cut and 2 third cut samples. I'm expecting our second cut to be very good as well. And once we get a few more samples of our first cut through and a sample of our 4th cut, which also looks really good, I'm expecting D values to be significantly up on last year for this year. So hopefully we'll be able to match 2021 again. I'll mention a few other little points and then we'll get on to the big topic of this video, the part which everyone gets wrong and no one pays any attention to, and that is fermentation. So what happens to your energy once you cut the grass in the field before you actually feed it out as silage. On this graph you will see crude protein percentage. Protein is really hard to manipulate. There's not a lot you can do, to be honest. There is 2 factors which affect it. Number 1 is the amount of nitrogen you apply to your silage crop. If you cut back on nitrogen, it's very likely your protein will drop. A good crude protein is 15-16%. I have had some silage samples up as high as 18-19-20%, and no, they haven't had a high ammonia value. Ammonia value, or nitrates, is also shown on the graph. The scale's a wee bit off, but it's because I never really need to worry about it. We never have high nitrates or ammonia levels in our grass, despite using an awful lot of fertilizer and having a very short cutting window. One of the key messages I want to get across in this video: stop testing your grass for nitrates. Please. Having high nitrates in your grass is not a reason to delay cutting your silage. If you do your fermentation correctly, nitrates will not be a problem. Nitrates can inhibit a bad fermentation and make it worse, which is why nitrates is seen as a problem. But just sort out the bigger problem, which is how you're sealing your silo, how you're rolling it, how you're fermenting your crop. We'll come on to that in a second. Sort that out and don't worry about nitrates. All the other factors like sugars, VFAs, pH, lactic acid, they are all going to come under fermentation, so we'll leave them for that. So at this point of the video, we're going to come on and talk about fermentation. And this is the point that everyone does badly, but it makes such a huge difference to your silage quality and how much you lose, how much dry matter loss you get from your grass. So broad principle of what your goal is for a good fermentation is at the point you cut your grass, you need to mentally have in your head that that grass is now dead, it is now wasting energy and rotting. And what is actually happening is the grass is now using its energy reserves to respire, and that is costing you money and costing you energy. That is why the rule, never leave your grass down longer than 24 hours, is absolutely true. Do not try to wilt your grass for 2 or 3 days. You are losing so much money and so much energy for no gain. That's also why a rapid wilt is so important. That's why tedding grass out on a really hot day and lifting it 2 hours after it's cut or 3 hours after it's cut makes a lot of sense. That's why a lot of my silage is now mowed in the morning and lifted that evening, because the period over the night where your grass is lying there rotting, respiring, whatever you want to call it, you'll lose about 0.3 ME. The core process of turning grass into silage relies on lactic acid. So that is an acid which is going to pickle your silage, and you want as much lactic acid as you possibly can get, and you want it produced as fast as possible. Once your silage pH drops to a certain point, the lactic acid will die off and you're left with a stable pickled silage which is not going to rot any further. So how do you get this rapid production of lactic acid? Well, the reason why you need to increase your dry matter is to increase your sugar concentration in the liquid portion of your silage. And if you have a high sugar level and a relatively high dry matter, 25, 26, 27%, that is enough energy for the lactic acid bacteria to feed on to produce lactic acid effectively. If you have a low dry matter, them bugs, them bacteria, they have to produce more lactic acid to get it to the same pH, because that lactic acid is more dilute. Does that make sense? And the problem with too dry of a silage is that there's not enough moisture there to mobilize the sugar and to get the lactic acid to be produced for long enough to get a stable pH. So that's why there is a balance between too wet silage and too dry silage. And in my opinion, anywhere from 23 to 30% dry matter is perfect. If you start going above 33, 34% dry matter, you just run into more problems down the line. You don't have a very good stable fermentation. You can get secondary heating. You can get wastage and rotting once you're feeding out. The bacteria that produce that lactic acid rely on anaerobic, I got that right, anaerobic conditions. So that means there's no oxygen. And that is why having a really well compacted, well rolled, well squeezed silage pit really matters. You want to get rid of as much oxygen as possible when you're filling your silage pit. That is why whenever we are doing our silage, we have a 10-ton JCB with a 1.5 ton buck rake rolling it all the time as it's filled. And we also have a 8-ton 260 horsepower tractor with a 1-ton weight block in the front and a 4-ton silage compactor on the back, also rolling the silo. It is overkill, but you need to be doing overkill to get a really, really dense, a really well packed silage pit with as little oxygen in it as possible, so that that lactoplantirum, that bacteria that produces the lactic acid, can get to work faster, get your pH dropping, and get your silage stable as fast as possible. Having a fast fermentation down to a stable pH is really, really important, and people neglect this all the time. Your silage is still essentially rotting when you put it into your silage pit until it reaches that stable pH. And the process of pickling your silage, the process of making that lactic acid, it produces water, which means that your dry matter can reduce once your silage is in your silage pit. It also eats your energy. So it eats your sugars, eats your carbohydrates, eats your protein. So the longer that takes, the more energy that takes and the more energy you lose. And that also costs you organic matter or actual silage. You lose some of what you put in just through the process of fermentation. So you want to minimize all of them losses by doing the job well and doing it as fast as possible. That is why rolling your silage pit is so important. The general rule for this is you want 25% of the tonnage you put in an hour to be rolling your silage pit. So on my farm, we do about 80 tons an hour. So that means we would need 20 tons to roll our silage pit. We have a bit more than that. We kind of go for overkill, but it is a really good rule, a really good principle. And if you have a giant self-propelled rocking up with 5 giant trailers carting for you, and you've 1 man on the buckrake on the silage pit, I hate to tell you, that is nowhere near enough weight to roll your silage pit in. And I don't care if it's a giant loading shovel, it doesn't matter. You need an extra vehicle on that silage pit. To be honest, I am a huge advocate for silage compactors. More people should have them, more people should use them. The repayment period on them is something like 4 to 5 years. It's not amazing, but they're going to last for a long time. They're essentially old train wheels. Let's chat about silage inoculants. We do use an inoculant. We use one called EcoSil, or EcoSil 100 to be exact. It uses a strain of Lactoplantirum called MTD1. It's been around since the 80s, and EcoSil have failed to ever discover a better strain of bacteria. There is plenty of research out there on EcoSil and Lactoplantirum MTD1. Google it if you want. It's a really good product. And what that does is it means that your silage is more efficient at converting sugar and energy and carbohydrates into lactic acid. Do not use the vast majority of inoculants. They are total rubbish and they have no research. EcoSil is the only one that I have seen to date, and I've looked many times, with proven animal performance trials to say they provide a benefit. And strangely, the way which they provide a benefit is a probiotic effect on the rumen rather than improving silage quality, although they do that as well. So, highly recommend EcoSil. I get paid nothing to say that. I don't know why they're not giving me my EcoSil for free at this point, since I have given them so much good PR. But as much as it pains me to do it again, they have a really good product, and I would much rather people use that rather than the other cons that are out there. Final thing I'll say on achieving a good fermentation is sealing your silage pit. We try to seal it as fast as possible, although sometimes life gets in the way, and if you've finished cutting silage at 10 o'clock at night, me, like everyone else, just wants to be done for the day, and we just seal it the next morning. We have sealed silage pits that evening before, usually first cut when silage fatigue hasn't set in and we're still really keen. But sealing your silo as fast as possible is really important. We do not use side sheets. That's a bit controversial. I know there's plenty of evidence that side sheets do a really good job. 2 reasons we don't use them. Number 1, it's an indoor silo, so it's less important. And number 2, they're just such a pain in the ass when you're feeding them out, and it's a small price to pay for an ease of management for the rest of the year, and it's a price I'm willing to pay. Let's chat about silage covers and what we use and what everyone kind of should be using. A single black cover or even 2 black covers is not enough to seal your silo. Black covers do a good job for protecting the surface. They're really thick, strong covers, but they do not do a good job of sealing the surface of your silo. There is a product called Cling Seal. It's like a cling film type product that is not impervious to oxygen. We will talk about oxygen barriers in a little moment. That does still allow oxygen through, but the advantage of a cling seal over a black cover is the cling seal is much more flexible, and it will suck down to the surface of your grass, and it effectively gets rid of the small air pockets that a black cover would leave. That is why it has such a good visual effect on the very top surface of your silage pit, because it has effectively got rid of a large supply of oxygen, which rots your silage. If you want to go to the next level, you want to use an oxygen barrier. An oxygen barrier looks very, very similar to a cling seal product. It does the same thing as a cling seal product in that it'll suck down onto the surface of the silage. It's a really thin, flexible film. But the oxygen barrier has an added benefit that it is much more impervious to oxygen. So oxygen can slowly leach through an oxygen barrier and a black cover. Oxygen barriers oxygen can't leak through an oxygen barrier. Oxygen can leak through a black cover, and it can leak through a cling seal type product and get into your silage. and that can cause problems with your fermentation. It can cause organic matter loss. Only in the top 60 centimeters or so, because it can't get through all of that silage and go deeper down. An oxygen barrier film does the same job as your cling seal film. It sucks to the surface, removes the actual oxygen pockets, the air pockets that are left, but it is also much more impervious to oxygen, which means that there's less oxygen in your top half a meter, 60 centimeters of your silage, which means that you preserve more of your organic matter, or the actual good part of your silage that you put in. So let's talk financial figures that I can actually justify. An oxygen barrier cover is expensive. It's like £300 for us to seal one of our silage pits, and the return on investment is about £700 of saved silage. There's no account made for extra silage quality, which I'm sure there is some, but there's no research to say there is. And there's no account made for less surface waste as well. The only way I'm getting that £700 is from less organic matter loss. Hopefully that makes sense. So as an absolute 100% guaranteed saving, okay, you're talking about twice the price of the oxygen barrier. So it's a 2-to-1 return on investment in the year you buy it. There's very little in farming that will beat that. So let's look at my first cut silage, and let's look at the fermentation characteristics, and I'm going to talk you through what they all mean and what they all show. And you can go look at your own silage sample and look at your fermentation characteristics and come to your own conclusions about if, like, in my opinion, the majority of farmers, where you're losing your energy and where you're doing a really bad job is not in the field, it's not in lifting the grass, it's in the silage pit and the fermentation. We'll go through the whole sample when we're here. Dry matter, 29.7, basically perfect. I probably would have liked 30, 0.3 off, not bad. I would say A+. We have an incredible protein percentage in our first cut. I can't really contribute anything I specifically done to this protein level. It just sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't. I'm happy with it. It's a great protein level. Energy levels, incredible. I've never seen a sample that was tested in a lab above 12.1. Yes, you can get your wee NIR machine to do a size sample. They're a load of rubbish. They're so inaccurate. Lab samples are the only way to judge. I've never seen higher, so very happy with ME and D value. D value is the result which is actually tested. ME is calculated from D value, or the other way around. The relationship is 6.25. So if you multiply ME by 6.25, you get your D value. I'm not going to check that figure. That's from memory. If you're sitting there at home with your calculator open doing that sum and it's not working out, I apologize. I got the number wrong. We're going to skip pH because we're going to talk about that in fermentation. We'll look at our ammonia. Ammonia is basically how much nitrogen was left in your grass from your fertilizer. People obsess over ammonia. I had applied a lot of nitrogen. I applied it on my first cut at the end of March. We cut at the start of May. There was very little nitrogen left in the grass. Sugars, 1.9%. The perfect sugar value is 2%. If you have more than 2% sugars, that is a sign of a bad fermentation. The fermentation process is bacteria using up your sugars to produce lactic acid. So the majority of our silage samples actually have a significantly lower sugar than that. We're usually sitting at like 0.2% because we have effectively used our sugars to produce lactic acid. Ash is a sign of contamination, how much soil is in your sward. We rake all of our grass, but we ted very, very little of it. Our ash values are always green. I don't really pay much attention to them. I think the rule is under 10% is pretty good. NDF is the fiber in your grass. If you want to make top quality grass, you kind of have to have a low NDF. It's a sign of how frequently you're cutting is your NDF value. Anywhere around 40 is perfect for NDF. We do have samples hitting 50 and they will still test well. So it's a useful figure. If you've silage at like 55, 56% NDF, you've left it way too long. We're going to skip ADF and oil. We're going to skip all of the next paragraph about MPB and MPN. They're used to calculate nutrition values in a process called feed into milk, or a calculation system called feed into milk. So you don't need to worry about them. And we're going to come down to the possibly two most important figures, in my opinion, to assess fermentation. And basically to assess overall silage quality, and that is the VFAs and the lactic acids. VFAs are like the bad bacteria. They're signs of a bad fermentation, they're signs of rotting. So if you have a high VFA, that's bad. That's a sign you've done a bad job. This VFAs are quite high. Normally I get under 30, 34.4 is not the end of the world. You will absolutely see silage samples 60, 70, 80. My lactic acid in this sample is also quite low. Usually I would be expecting over 100, maybe 120, 130, but it's probably linked to the higher dry matter than normal. So if you have a higher dry matter, you will naturally have a lower lactic acid because, like I discussed earlier, the bacteria don't have the ability to bring the pH down as low. Intake is a calculated value, rumen stability value is a calculated value, and feed into milk potential acid load are a calculated value, so I don't really pay attention to them. They're based on the values up above, so they don't really tell you anything new. And if all of this sounds complicated, sounds like a lot of effort, and you're thinking to yourself, our silage making system's fine, I don't want to spend that extra money to try to make the really good silage, I don't need to do that. Let me show you one final graph which will change your mind. This graph is from the research document linked down below, and it shows the dry matter losses at each stage of the silage making process. So to put some numbers on this, we make about 3,500 to 4,000 tons of silage a year. So for easy counting, let's say 4,000 tons, and let's say £30 a ton of silage. That's how much it costs us. It actually costs us more, but we'll go on the low side. So our silage is worth about £120,000 a year at least. So let's take a look at this graph, and this is showing dry matter losses. So that is how much of this £120,000 worth of silage you will lose at each stage of the process. The two colours of bar I want to just focus on are the white bar and the light grey bar. And we'll go left to right. So field curing, respiration and harvesting. If you do a good job of that, you will lose 4%. And if you do a bad job of that, you will lose a further 11%. So 11% of £120,000 is £12,000 a year. If you do a bad job of getting your grass cut and dried and in the silage pit as fast as possible. If you move over to in-silo respiration, fermentation and effluent. So basically, if you do a good job of fermenting your silage, if you're using an oxygen barrier, using Ecosil, a good inoculant, there is no other good inoculants in my opinion. If you're compacting your silage well, you will still lose about 5%. That's part of the fermentation process. It requires energy to do that. If you do a bad job, you will lose a further 13%. So that's another £15,000 you could potentially be throwing away and losing by doing a bad job of sealing your silage pits. The final bar is more about feed out, so it's how fast you're moving across your silage face, how sharp is your shear grab, do you have a nice tight layer along the top of your silage pit when you're rolling your cover back to stop oxygen getting under it, do you put enough tires on the top of your silage pit, do you use new covers every year, or do you try to use old covers with holes in them, do you use side sheets? We don't, I know that's bad, but a good well managed pit face and top, you will lose 3%. You do a really bad job of that, you could lose up to 18%, which is £20,000 plus. So the scales of losses that you can get by doing a bad job of making silage is huge. So yes, everything I've said here has an extra cost. Doing 4 cuts over 2 cuts has a big extra cost. Tedding your grass has an extra cost. Raking your grass has an extra cost. Paying people to mow because you know you can't get enough mowed in the 4 or 5 hour window in the early afternoon has an extra cost. But them extra costs are more than justified and will more than pay you back. That's really the core point I want to get across, is that doing a cheap silage system and getting bad quality silage is a huge false economy. Oh, my tea's stone cold. How long have I been recording this? I hope this was helpful. I know it's a very different video, but it took me a decade to learn all of this stuff, and the way that the information I've presented to you is normally presented is in research documents. They're extremely technical, they're hard to understand, they're hard to put into practice. Hopefully this is a little bit easier for someone to watch and think, I could change that. That's a good point. I never thought about that. Maybe that's why we can't make the best possible silage. And my final point on all of this is that you never get everything perfect. Silage is always going to be a compromise between something and something else. There's plenty of times I've cut silage in the rain. My third cut that I fed 2 weeks ago and a sample of was 19.5% dry matter. It got rained on twice. It was not a good cut of silage, but I got the energy. And that's the compromise. I cut it when it needed to be cut, and I didn't worry so much about whether it was going to get rained on or not. And having a good fermentation process, having good pit management, using a compactor, that meant that even at that low dry matter, I could get a good fermentation. So there is compromises, but it's about knowing what is the right compromise to make, if that makes sense. Anyway, we'll be back next week with another video. I have no idea what it's going to be. If you like this kind of sit down, talking, technical, almost like teaching video, I'm not saying I'm an expert in everything. This is literally the one thing I'm good at. Don't ask me about animal health or genetics or any of that stuff. I'm rubbish at that. Someone else can do that in videos. But if you like this sort of thing, leave a comment, let me know, like the video, subscribe. I'm just doing something different on YouTube. I'm trying to be different, like going out of my way to try to be different. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, that's okay. I like to iterate, try new things and see what happens. So until next week, thanks for watching.